first off, I say marriage is not to affirm adults, it's for the protection of children. And if love is the only factor, where do you draw the boundaries?
Well, what the Supreme Court said in the cases that it decided last year involving the defense of marriage case, striking that down, is that children do matter. There are thousands and tens of thousands of children in same-sex marriage households. They deserve the right to equality and the same respect and decency that other people have that living right next door.
Mr. Perkins?
Well, but we know from the social science that children do best with a mom and a dad. That's why our policies in this country have preferred marriage and given benefits to it. But let me, if love is the factor, what boundaries are there?
You want the sky to fall because two people that are living next door to you, what court after court after court has said that allowing people of the same sex to marry the person that they love and be a part of our community and to be treated equally does no damage to heterosexual marriage, and it does. And what the court after court after court has said that children living in a same-sex relationship do as well or better than people in other communities.
The court doesn't study this social fact.
The court
but let me
evidence.
ask you, what are the boundaries, though? If it's just love, what are the boundaries? Where can we go with marriage?
What are you suggesting? That they're going to be polygamy? That people will be marrying their pets?
No, I didn't say that. If we remove the natural established boundaries for marriage, the union of a man and a woman, we've removed those boundaries, those guardrails. There is no arbitrary boundary
that Ted Olson makes, which he said, all right, you and your wife live happily in this house. There's a same-sex couple living here. What's the damage to you?
Well, let's talk about that. Let's talk about the wedding vendors that have been put out of business. Let's talk about...
I'm not talking about that. It's a different issue. No, it's a different issue. It's a different issue. I'm asking you, what's the impact on you and your family to have these people living next door?
Let's talk about it. Let's talk about my children. All of a sudden in school are taught values and morals that contradict what I teach as a parent at home. That's happening already across the country in those states that have recognized and forced same-sex marriage on the states. But let's talk about the business place. Let's talk about Aaron and Melissa Klein, a bakery in Oregon, forced out of business, forced to pay $150,000 in fines simply because they didn't want to participate in a same-sex wedding.
We're going to get to that in a second, but your argument as to whether somehow this damages the Perkins to have another couple next door.
Well, everyone who's ever talked about this says that there's no heterosexual couple that is going to decide to get divorced or not to get married or not to raise children just because another couple next to them is treated equally and with respect and decency under our Constitution. That is why we have courts. The same argument Mr. Perkins was making was made with respect to interracial marriages in 1967. 30-some states at one point prohibited interracial marriages. And talk about the color of the skin. People were making the same arguments. Marriage is wrong between people of different races. We have to stop that. When the Supreme Court finally acted, 16 states were still prohibiting interracial marriages. As far as the marriage vendors, the people in the flower business or in the cake business or whatever it happens to be, we have civil rights laws that say if you're going to engage in commerce, you're not going to discriminate against people on the basis of their religion, of their sex, or their race. That's a simple solution to the problem. Massachusetts allowed sgoing same-sex marriage 10 years ago. Nobody's been put out of business in Massachusetts. It's a canard.
I'm going to give you the final word, and in your answer, I'd like you to talk about what role you think this will play in the 2016 Republican presidential battle.
Well, look, adoption agencies have been put out of business in Massachusetts. Parents have been denied the right to determine the values their children are taught. This affects families. It affects all of Americans, and it's wrong for the court to take away the voice of the people. I think it's an issue not only in 2016. Like Roe v. Wade, the court wanted it to go away 41 years ago. It's still here. This issue will be here for decades to come if the court does not allow the states and the people to deal with it.
Mr. Perkins, Mr. Olson, we want to thank you both so much for coming in today. I thought it was going to be interesting. It was indeed, and we will stay on top of this issue both in and outside the courts. Thank you, gentlemen.
Chris. All right.